Congratulations.
Thank you.
The film certainly is chilling as ever. I want to ask some more general questions about your career before we get into 0 Days. First of all, you mentioned in the opening remarks that things change with this new administration. You've worked under two administrations, the Bush and the Obama. Does the political climate sort of inform your idea of the mission of a documentary filmmaker?
Well, I think this new one does, and I try to get that across in my remarks. But I mean, I don't think, to some extent, it's the job of every documentary filmmaker to go where they will, and I don't think it's they should initially change what they do according to the administration. But this one appears to be an existential threat to what we do. So yes, I would say that's requires a change in thinking.
Now, we talked about the statistics, 28 films in 11 years. That streak began when you were about 50 years old or so. Could you just talk about what led you, what impelled you to become a documentary filmmaker and then create so many films? Was there a revelation or a road to Damascus moment that sort of spurred you on?
Well, the fact is, there were a lot of years, as my wife would tell you, where I couldn't get any films made. So we were wondering, how to. Seriously, I mean, I bummed around from job to job. I couldn't get anything started, and then at a certain point, for a variety of reasons, I was able to get some things off the ground, and then I made Enron, and things started to take off. I think in terms of the number of films, so there was clearly a pent-up desire to do stuff that I hadn't been able to do, but also a couple of things happened. One is I'm probably definitely very much on the ADD side, and unless I, become overcommitted, I can't really focus. But I also learned something very peculiar, which was that, and it was when I was making, after I made Enron, which I only did Enron, and I had to make it on a very brief schedule, a very tight schedule, which caused a lot of problems because we were having difficulty getting people to talk and so forth and so on. We got very lucky toward the end, but it could have gone very badly if we hadn't been able to do it because we didn't have enough time, we didn't have enough money, and when the money ran out, that was it. When I was making Taxi to the Dark Side, I was also supposed to have already finished a film about Hunter S. Thompson called Gonzo. But there was problems with the estate and so forth and so on. And so it ended up that I had these two films in the cutting room at the same time, which wasn't the intent. But I discovered, oddly, that it was beneficial. And it was beneficial for a couple of reasons. One was, in terms of content, Taxi was a very dark film that took myself and my editor, frankly, into a very dark psychic place. We changed as people, seeing those images of torture day in and day out. It was a tonic, frankly, and kept me sane to be able to walk over. Again, there were dark parts of Hunter S. Thompson, but there were a lot of laughs with Hunter, and that allowed me to get some balance. But in addition, I found that one of the hardest parts of making a film in the cutting room is structure, is narrative structure. And when you're in the weeds and you're trying to solve areas of certain, when you're looking into certain scenes and how they should work and what this transition should be and so forth and so on, it's very hard to see the forest for the trees. And we had discovered, I discovered it on other films that, when you step away and you leave the film for about 3 weeks, which is not always easy to do pragmatically, you come back and suddenly you see things that you weren't able to see before. Well, the same thing happened for me when I was able to go from one film to another. I was intensely work on one film, I'd step out, I'd go into the other cutting room, I'd be able to see things I wasn't able to see. And also I work with editors who don't like me hovering over their shoulder and tapping them, as famously as Godard used to do, tapped them on the shoulders, and he would, so that they would cut. They like to do their thing, show it to me, and then I give them comments. So I learned that actually was profitable for me. And so I have these, I had a couple of small groups, because this film took 4 years to make. We didn't rush it out the door. But the value was that, unlike Enron, when we ran into a problem, we didn't have to then just zip up the patient and hope that we could, hope he'd survive. We could wait, try to get that next interview, and see if we could worry the problem of the film. So a number of films in the cutting room at the same time is what ended up happening. And
in those lean years, did you know you had the ability to create this jigsaw productions and have many films going at the same time, which takes both you're a creator and then you were also an organizational leader?
Well, I kept telling my wife that I had the ability to do so, but there was a long period of years where she didn't believe me. Look, my company, I made a decision to create more of a company in the last 3 or 4 years. And I had to make a decision, and that was a big step because that required an administrative level that I hadn't really reckoned with before. Prior to that, my company was a bookkeeper and a part-time assistant, and we would just roll from one project to another. Having a company did free me up from the need to be my own lawyer, be my own, fundraiser, do everything on a kind of administrative level. So that's been also liberating. Suddenly I thought, wow, I have all this time. I don't have to read all those contracts anymore. I can pay attention to the films.
Now, you're there for all the interviews. Do you have the ability to read whether the person's telling you the truth or not? Has that developed over time and you can tell what the person's actually saying or not saying?
No. It's very hard to tell. And I learned over time that many people lie to me in the chair. And frankly, mostly my job is not to be Mike Wallace. My job is not to say gotcha so that I can look good and they can look bad. My job actually is to get out of them the story that they want to tell. And if it turns out that they're lying to me, I can find out later on. And sometimes I find things, it doesn't have so much to do with what they're saying necessarily. Again, it depends on the kind of film I'm making. There's a film I did called Client 9 about Elliot Spitzer, where there's a lot of that in that film, where you look at people and they tell you one thing, but their eyes are telling you something very different. So I learned over time that they may be lying to me, and I have to expect that that's possible, but my job in the moment is not to try to catch them in a lie. It's to keep probing, and sometimes good things happen. And sometimes I find that the dumb questions, the stupid questions, end up being the best questions. The questions of, I'm not sure I understand. Could you explain that? Could you give me an example? Those kinds of questions tend to yield the best stuff. And one other thing I learned early on was when I was making a Frontline, way back in the day, I was working with a correspondent who was a very wise man and an excellent writer. And he was interviewing an airline executive. It was a rapacious airline executive who ran Eastern Airlines into the ground. It was bankrupting companies in order to, void union contracts. He asked him all these questions, and he had a pressed trench coat, and every question was perfectly formulated. He spoke in complete sentences. And the responses he got back from the president of the airline were kind of predictable, sharp, but not revelatory in any way, shape, or form. I then asked if I could ask a few questions, and my questions were awkward, dumb, sort of halting, but ended up in the cutting room. We saw that actually what he told me was far more revealing than what he told him, because he was much more on his guard, and it wasn't as much of a conversation. That's another thing I learned over time. Like the worst possible, one of the things they always tell you, when you're starting out is, be sure to tell the interview subject to include your question in the answer. It's like, that is the worst fucking possible advice I could ever think of, because that's a way of saying, remember to think about what you're going to say before you say it. What could be worse? I just say have a conversation, because also for editing now, there isn't that need for that kind of rigid, perfect continuity. You can cut to whatever you want to cut to. It's having that conversation that ends up being much more important, I think. And it ends up also being far more humane.
And some of your major subjects, you never really had that conversation, like Julia Assange. And
Well, I had the conversation, but we weren't able to film it. I was locked in a room with him for 6 hours trying to persuade him to talk. That would have been a really interesting film, to film that exchange. And actually, I believe he audio tape recorded it, but I don't think, it was secretly, but I don't believe he found it in his interest to release it because he might not have looked so good.
and even Steve Bartman, who you did a whole film about, the Cubs fan. But you never talked to him. Did you have an imaginary conversation of what it was like to be him at that game?
I did. But one of the things I discovered, both about Julian in We Steal Secrets and Steve Bartman, is sometimes when people don't talk to you, that's interesting, because then you can make a film about that. At the end of the day, I think the Steve Bartman film, because of who Steve is and because of that incident, was much more interesting for Bartman not having talked to me than if he had talked to me. His silence spoke volumes. Likewise, with Julian, he refused to talk to me on camera. So I ended up being a lot more interested in Chelsea Manning, who at that time had been completely ignored. You know, everybody thought of Julian as the leaker. He wasn't the leaker, he was the publisher. Chelsea Manning made WikiLeaks. If we wouldn't have heard of WikiLeaks if it weren't for Chelsea Manning, but nobody was paying any attention. But that refusal to speak ended up taking me on an interesting path that I wouldn't have thought of.
And for 0 Days, when did you come up with the concept of having the digital character? Why did you think that was important to have one actress reading comments by other NSA people?
It was purely evolutionary. We had a problem, which was nobody was talking, as you can see from earlier in the film. And the people we did start to talk to, who either were at or had been at NSA, were not comfortable talking because they thought they might quickly end up in jail. And indeed, you know, I should add that General Cartwright, who was never prosecuted for leaking, did reach a plea agreement he pled guilty to lying to the FBI as a result of that investigation. That meant that they could go after him legally, but they wouldn't have to reveal anything about Stuxnet. So the risks were great. In order to persuade them to come forward, we came up with a conceit, which was a variation on something I had done in Client 9, actually. And we said, well, what if we created a fictional character? And it's an amalgam character so that you won't be identified. And we'll create a character and we'll use an actress. And they liked that idea. So they were able to be more forthright. They told us more. And then I had to figure out a way formally to integrate that into the film. And it seemed to me that this way of digitizing her was consonant with the rest of the film. And also, in its own way, made a comment on secrecy, because we purposefully, we shot her on a really cool new technology which allowed us to vary the dots and the lines and the flesh, and also to do camera moves after the fact. But what we did was, as the film went along, we showed more and more of her face so that viewers would say, "Whoa, you're showing too much. That's terrible. She's going to be discovered," which was part of the point.
Now, every new film for you is a challenge. And did this sort of, working with the digital actor, did that impel you to think about doing a narrative fictional film, which you're now doing, and now using all actors and casting it? You talk about the action.
Sure. I actually started out as a fiction film editor. That was my beginning in the business. In film school I made documentaries, but then I started working cutting trailers and then doing recuts of movies and then cutting movies. So I was always interested in that. And over the years, I had been offered this or that project, but they weren't particularly interesting projects. And frankly, I was having a ball making documentaries, so why would I want to? But there's a couple of projects that made more sense to do as fiction, and so one that I'm doing now is called The Action, and it's based on a book by a Washington Post reporter named Betty Metzger called The Burglary, and it's about a group of citizens which has become much more relevant since the election, about a group of citizens who have some vague sense that the FBI is abusing their power, but they don't know exactly how or why. So they plan a heist, and they break in to the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, steal all the papers, and they discovered what became known as COINTELPRO, Hoover's massive spying operation. So anyway, that's it, and we're casting it, and hopefully, we'll go in the fall.
Do you have other documentary projects you're going to work on at the same time?
Well, there's one I'm finishing now. It's a murder mystery, kind of what happens. It's a Northern Ireland murder mystery, but it's sort of the idea of like, how do you reckon with the past? Particularly when it's violent and brutal, and how do you find some justice and reckon with a government that's trying to hide the past? And there'll probably be other documentary projects that come along. Right now, I'm also involved in a TV fiction project based on Lawrence Wright's book, The Looming Tower. So I may take a break from documentaries for a bit, but we'll certainly return there.
I know we don't have that much time left. Does anyone have questions about 0 Days or Alex's career?
I just want to congratulate you. I think it's a
Susan?
great film,
Thank you.
and a really important film.
Thank you.
How did you
Don
get
Pennebaker?
The interiors of the Iranian labs, is that material that they put out
Yes,
officially?
yes. That's the remarkable thing.
It's
The-
amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing that he was so proud, Ahmadinejad was so proud of the Natanz plant that he did these walkthroughs, which ended up being hugely valuable to the CIA and the Mossad.
How did you get that footage? Was that?
It took a long time. Some of it was easy to get. Some of it we got through London. Some of it we got through sources in Iran. It took a while to piece it all together, but it wasn't hugely difficult.
Other questions? Yes, right here.
What were the hardest people to get access to in this film? I mean, they all were.
The hardest people to get access to are the people who are not in the film. They were really hard.
But how hard was it to get Hayden?
Not so hard. Mike likes to talk, and it's the second film I've interviewed him for. And also, he was just about to come out with a book. And he's in the security business now. And so part of what he does with Michael Chertoff is to, consult on how to keep yourself secure in a world of cyber threat. So what better? Now, I was interviewing him about Stuxnet. The surprise for me from Michael Hayden was what he had to say about Israel, particularly the decision tree with Bush in terms of the idea that they figured that what was going on here was that if Israel was threatening to bomb Iran, it wasn't about bombing Iran, it was about getting us into a war with Iran. That was something that I was very surprised that he was so forthcoming about.
Alex, do you think that there was some cyber hanky-panky with this election?
Yes, certainly there was. I mean, the Russians, for sure, hacked into the DNC and the Podesta account. I should say that that wasn't the most sophisticated kind of hacking. Those were spear phishing attacks, which were basically Podesta or whoever's operating his account, didn't have two-factor authentication, which everybody should have, and he gave up his password, and that's how they got in. But we know that account was targeting other people that were that were of great interest to Russia. So there's no doubt that Russia was doing that. They may have done other things that we don't know about. I'm told by people who work with the Russian security services or know a lot about it that the goal was not necessarily to swing the election to Trump. The goal was to cause mischief and create confusion and mess with our heads so that, the Russians could say, American democracy doesn't work so well.
How about Assange? Were you surprised at all about his role in the election?
Not at all. I don't think that Assange either thinks of himself as an agent of Russia, or I read an op-ed about this, or would be an agent of Russia. He's too proud for that. But Assange, for all his genius in some ways, is a petty, narcissistic, self-interested person. He hated Hillary Clinton, and so he was more than happy to do whatever he could to undermine her candidacy. I think it was personal for Julian Assange.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How do you feel about the security of our voting system in terms of the counting of votes, not voter fraud, but election fraud? Do you have any feelings about that?
I'm told that it's very hard to hack into it on a much broader level, but I think that will be one of the interesting things that might come out if the recounts are allowed to proceed. You know, some people have probably been following that, but there are some statistical anomalies in terms of the disparity between online polling, between polling and the actual results in places where there were computer voting. So we'll see. I mean, people have raised issues about that before. I'm concerned, but I don't know enough about it to be expert. When did I finish it? It premiered at Berlin last year. So 2000, earlier this year. So Berlin this year, February 2016 it premiered, and I think it had a theatrical release in the summer of this year and was just on Showtime.
Has it had the impact that you wanted, or do you think it?
You know, I think that a lot of noise over the election, kind of overshadowed the importance of this film, in my view. I think if the film had come out right after the fracas over the DNC and Podesta hacks, it might have been different. I think that it's starting to have more and more of an impact. I'm getting more and more traffic, seeing more traffic. It is interesting, you know, something happened just recently, which comes right out of the pages of Stuxnet, with a lot of Trump's breastfeeding about Iran. The Iranians launched another attack with the exact same weapon that they used before, and they wiped out Saudi Aramco's computers again. And so they're sending a very loud message to President Trump, go for it. And he may.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, just congratulations on an amazing film. I'm fascinated by the composite character that you had, but to the extent that you made her so real, and all the technology that was involved in making her real. When you did the reveal, and we understand that she was a composite and different voices, understandably, because those people wouldn't speak on the record. Or did you feel that there was a little bit of a tension there, because on one hand she was real, and in fact, you know, me sitting here, I wanted to date her. I thought she was amazing. But you know, did you know, on the other hand, you know, it was really just a conceit, and it was just different voices coming together. Were you torn about using that conceit, that approach, or did you feel it? I guess you felt it worked, but I just had a question about it.
Sure. I was torn about it. I would have rather have had the people come forward on the record. But I did feel that for source protection, it was viable, and also because it's revealed. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not hidden. And the process by even noting that it was composite. I didn't do that at the beginning. I did it at the end for two reasons. One is I was playing with the whole idea of secrecy, and I wouldn't have been able to play with that so effectively if I had revealed the device at the beginning. Then it would have just been a purely formal thing. And I think there is an identification. You become involved in a cinematic way with this character. I think that was fine. It would have been reprehensible if I hadn't disclosed that A, she was an actress, and B, that she represented a composite character. So I felt that by revealing it, it was okay. In print, you have access to different ways of handling that problem than you do in cinema. If I had had 3 different people, all of whom were photographed in shadow, all of whom had different kinds of metallic voices, it really would have been very difficult to follow and almost incomprehensible. So to some extent, I was using it for a narrative reason too.
And also in Zero Days, you always choose a different cinematic style. This, you have the idea of a spy thriller, of James Bond or Jason Bourne. When do you decide that you want that sort of style to permeate the film?
It usually happens early, but usually the working out of it, we always knew we wanted kind of a Bourne-like globe-hopping style for this. The hard part early on, because I was just going in the front door with a lot of places, was how to frame the detective story. And that didn't happen for us until we found the two guys from Symantec. They were our detectives. Once we had them, then they could lead us through. And they could lead us through the code, which was something we could deal with. From a formal perspective, it took us a lot of work. You know, I work on some films like this and We Steal Secrets. I work a lot with graphics. But the key with graphics is a lot of graphics companies are great at doing whiz-bang stuff that looks great, but there's no character to it. And what we had to work with very hard was not only to put the real code in the graphics, but also that the Stuxnet code became a character, which meant it had to evolve over time. There was a character arc for the Stuxnet virus, and that took a long time to work out. I mean, really long time.
Did you?
It was, yeah. The question was about how did the code, this question? Oh, he was just saying it was quite accurate.
Did you know, meeting Eric, that he would immediately be a perfect person to explain this, Eric Sheehan?
Well, when I interviewed Eric and Liam, one of the great things for me was that they were great storytellers. Now, they had had some practice. They'd been interviewed about this before, but also they live in an area where most people come to them and it's like, please give us the soundbite, and then they leave. Nobody had really sat down with them and said, take us through step by step by step, give us the whole story. They loved that. And so that got a lot of enthusiasm. And by the way, we went back to them over and over and over again throughout the film. We bugged them endlessly. Is this the right piece of code we're using in the right place, and so forth and so on. But I think they were thrilled to be able to, as most people are, to tell their story, but not to tell it in a way where they have to give the quick soundbite. They wanted to tell the whole story.
Question back there.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about Congress and why you may not, or I'm trying to put all the timing together when they actually invited Netanyahu to the White House and the letter they had written that was controversial regarding Iran and why you didn't, I don't know that you had to at all, but the relationship between the timing of that. You know?
I do, and I'm not gonna get it right. Ultimately, in order to boil down this narrative, which is jumping back and forward in time, we didn't set the moment. I mean, when you see Netanyahu giving the speech, that's at the UN. I didn't include Netanyahu's speech in Congress, but I was trying to give a flavor, an overall flavor of Netanyahu's views on Iran and how that was pushing the process. But
do you think Congress would have written that letter and invited him had they known that Netanyahu may have brought us to war by having us been, you know, looked at as putting the Stuxnet in?
it's hard to know. I mean, I found that whole part, I found that whole thing to be utterly appalling, you know, because a lot of foreign policy goes on in ways which, of course, the ranking members of the committees are briefed, but in ways which, other than that, are necessarily confidential and secret. And so to make that a political event, even while people are trying to come up with an agreement with Iran, you know, was just utterly reprehensible. But that's just my point of view.
Yes, Susan.
You probably know more about this than 99.9% of the American public. And I'm wondering, since Trump has been elected, do you have a perspective, a different perspective on what you now know, knowing that this man's going to be in the White House?
Yeah, I'm terrified. That's my different perspective. I mean, you know, and that was the point just now, you know, talking about what Iran has just done a few days ago, 2 days ago, I think, with Saudi Arabia. I mean, that gives you some inclination about how delicate and problematic this stuff is. And I don't think that Trump has a clue. I mean, when David Sanger interviewed Trump during the election campaign, he said, he asked him a question about cyber. And because, his platform was Make America Great Again, he said, well, America's way behind in cyber. We barely got started in cyber, which is idiocy. It couldn't be further from the truth. It shows a total and appalling lack of knowledge. So yeah, I'm terrified. I mean, he's going to have these weapons at his disposal. His attention span is not nearly that long.
Okay, well, once again, thank you, Alex Gibney, for coming in.
Thank you all. Thank you all very much.